Hello and welcome to World of Tanks with Dsann. In today's video we'll be looking at armor mechanics and how to best utilize these to increase survivability in combat. This tutorial will consist of several parts, including basic armor mechanics and penetration mechanics, as well as some techniques that utilize these mechanics in combat. These techniques will of course be shown off using replays, and you can see annotations to all the parts right now. And now onto armor and penetration mechanics. The reason I do these two at the same time is because they are extremely closely connected in that you can't really utilize one without the other. Now, before I start, I'd just like to point out that all tanks do have armor, as I would expect most people to know. They have significantly higher frontal than side or rear, generally speaking, and the turret, especially the mantlet, which is this bit here, is generally some of the most armored parts of a tank. Now, if we look at my Caernarvon, we can see that it has 130 millimeters of frontal armor. The sides is 51 millimeters, and the rear is 38 millimeters. Now, the turret has its own armor values at 165 frontal, but obviously the mantlet increases that significantly. The sides and rear are both 112 millimeters, which is quite a decent armoring, but obviously not the best. If we look at my Russian Tier 8 Heavy, the IS-3, it has 110 frontal armor, 90 side, and 60 rear, but the turret has a rather good 220 millimeters all round. Now, the reason this tank has low armor is because of other reasons that I will get into in a minute. Before that, I would like to explain how shell mechanics work and how hitting stuff works. Basically, when you fire your shot, the first thing it determines is, did you hit? This is obviously not a surprise to most people, but still has to be said. Did you hit or did you not? The second thing it does is, where did you hit? And the third thing is, what did you hit? Now, the reason I say what did you hit is because armor is not unique or solid. It varies in place to place. Tanks have weak spots. This is a simple fact. For example, on the Caernarvon, this would be weaker than this part. And this part down here, known as the lower glacis, is generally on most tanks weaker than the upper glacis, which is this metal plate here. When you have hit, it then figures out the angle you hit at, i.e. if you're hitting like here or here, as well as the sloping of the armor. Now when it figures that out, it then has to calculate, does the shell have enough to penetrate that armor at that angle? The reason that is the steeper the angle the armor is, the harder it is to penetrate because you increase your effective armor. Now there's a bunch of math behind this that I'm not going to get into, but suffice to say, the steeper the angle is better. So this is much better than, say, if we look at my VK 3001P, which is a tier 6, you see that this is mostly flat and easier to penetrate than this. Now, when you've hit and it's figured out, okay, what angles and everything, then it applies normalization to your AP, ACPR, and heat rounds, which I'll get into later. But normalization basically means that it'll reduce the effective armor, armor angle. So if you hit straight on here with, say, AP ammo, and it has a normalization of 5, which is the average, that means that if this was 45 degrees, you would now be hitting at 40 degrees, which would reduce the effective armor. After that, it figures out, does the shell have enough penetration to go through? Now, there are two types of armor I would like to add before I go any further, and that is your standard armor like this, but also spaced armor, which includes mantlets, as well as, if we look at the IS-3 again, this area here consists of spaced armor and is in fact just emptied. The real hull of the IS-3 actually starts along this line here. So anything from inside here is obviously armor, but this whole area is spaced, and tracks generally count as spaced armor because the shell has to go through them. Spaced armor reduces the penetration by as much as the spaced armor is, so if, say, the spaced armor is 10 millimeters and you have 110, you will then be hitting with 100 millimeters left, roughly speaking. Now, after it's penetrated the first one, or the only one if it's not spaced, it figures out, does it have enough penetration to go through? And if it does, it goes in and does damage based off rolls and the numbers of the gun. So for example, if we look at the gun off my Caernarvon, you can see that it has 226 penetration and a 230 damage. This thing will go through another Carnarvon's frontal plate like butter. This is just how the tank is, and that's why we utilize more advanced tactics like hull down, which I'll explain later. Now, if we look at the IS-3, the reason this thing is still a very solid tank, even though it has on paper thin as heck armor, is because of this part here known as the pike nose. This has an extreme angle, and while most tanks you would like to increase your effective angle and thus effective armor by doing this to angle your hull, which I'll go a little bit more in depth in later, the IS-3 and the IS-8 and 7, which are basically the tier 8, 9, and 10 of the Russian heavy, one of the Russian heavy lines, have that built in via this pike nose. In fact, these things are much more effective head on. So you will hit here, it'll bounce off that way or that way, but if you were to angle this tank, you will notice that you have a flatter surface. Thus you will go right through it. This is very significant when facing these tanks, and the more you understand these mechanics, the more effective you will be. Now, this Carnarvon, for example, while having relatively thin frontal and, well, hull armor in general, if this thing gets behind cover so you can only see the turret, this thing will ricochet so many shots, it is unbelievable. But the frontal plate can actually be quite solid, and I know for a fact that the 175 penetration of the IS-6, which I will show the gun right about now, this gun cannot penetrate a Carnarvon from 100 meters or close, well, from anywhere on this plate here. Here, yes, but here, no, as I will show you in a replay from me trying to get an angling replay, but unfortunately this tank was trolling me a bit, so I had to use a different vehicle. And that is pretty much the basic armor and penetration mechanics explained, and now we'll move on to the angling section of the tutorial, where I will also be showing a couple of replays, including the one where this one decided that I didn't need to angle at all. In this part, I will explain how angling works. Now, angling is very simple, as in the name, as you can probably guess, means you'll angle the tank to one side or the other. Why we do this is to increase the effective angle here, but also the effective angle here, so that shots will ricochet off either part. And even if you should get penetrated here, the tracks will absorb much of the damage due to the fact that they are relatively thick on this tank, so it'll have to go through quite a bit more on this angle. I believe this is most roughly the optimal angle on this tank. And this tank is fine at it. Most tanks are. Some are complete garbage at it, like the IS-3, the IS-8, and the IS-7, because of the pike nose. The pike nose reduces the effectiveness of angling due to, you know, the fact that this is already pre-angled, if you will, and the more you angle it, the steeper, or the flatter this angle becomes, or this one for that matter, allowing them to penetrate you more easily, because, again, this thing only has 110 millimeters of armor. So, obviously, like this. Now, there are certain ranges, it's not much, I don't remember the exact range band, but at a certain range, this becomes a more viable target than here, in which case, then it is okay to angle to try and reduce this. Ideally, in that situation, you want to wobble your tank to make it harder for them to hit your weak spots. And, but yeah, this tank, and it's pretty much the same with this one, although, as you see, this one isn't quite as extreme, and it's got a much higher frontal plate. This one, you might want to do this again with, or if you can cover this, obviously just head on. Now, for this tutorial, I have used the Type 59, which is a Tier 8 premium medium tank. As you can see, it has 100 millimeters of frontal armor, 80 side, and 45 rear. Now, what we're interested in, obviously, is the side and front armor, because, obviously, this is about what you want to show them of your tank. Turret is irrelevant, as well, and especially this tank, very few things can actually get through that turret at its tier. It's actually quite bouncy. For the opponent, we have used my friend's IS-6, which, as I mentioned earlier, has 175 millimeters of penetration. And we will start at 100 meters, taking 4 shots head-on, and then it'll be 4 shots at an angle. And then we will also try the same on the lower plate, as I mentioned in the previous one, that this is slightly weaker because it's thinner metal. And that's pretty much it. On to the replays. Okay, here we are at the angling tutorial. I've skipped ahead a bit, so you didn't have to watch me driving to meet my adversary in this match. My friend Uruchi, driving his IS-6, Tier 8 Russian Premium Heavy, whereas I'm in my Type 59 Premium Medium. He has 175 millimeters of penetration, whereas I only have 100 millimeters of armor. But as you can see, his first shot while we were starting the test kind of missed, so he hit the armor of my turret, which just bounced it like it wasn't even, like it was a fly basically. So 4 shots this angle, 4 shots at head on, 4 shots at an angle, and then to show some of the negative effects of extreme angling like I did. So bear in mind his reload is kind of slow, so it will take about 11 seconds between the shots, so just have some patience. So now we wait for his first shot to hit, that hits the frontal plate. That's one hit, and that's a ricochet. As you can see, it hit right there, that big white spot at the bottom, bounced up and off the tank. Second shot, not so lucky. If you can just about see the hole there, or you can just see the hole there. If you notice the little periscopes on the top of the tank, kind of, not the turret, but the top of the hull, that's where the driver is, and that's why my driver got taken out, as you can see down here. And I'll explain the effects of that in another video probably. So that's one hit, one penetration, and one bounce. Shot number 2 is coming now, and that is a penetration again. As you can see in the bottom left corner, I've taken 2 hits, which means the last one, the other 2 have been bounces. But here comes the 4th shot, and that is another bounce. So 50-50 bounce to penetration ratio, if you will. Now, as you can see, we angle. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a steep angle, and you'll see why later. But for the frontal plate, as you see, 1 bounce already. And then second shot comes, bounces. And then the 3rd shot comes, bounces, so that's 3 ricochets in a row. And I imagine if the other guy, this was a real match, the other guy would be rather frustrated right now, because I'd be shooting back. And that's 4 shells. And for 0 damage. Now you'll get to see why this is a bad position. Notice that he hit right there, which is obviously not a very good position. And as you see, I took another 300, almost 400 damage, and I'm down to 167. So I decide, okay, let's try a slightly shallower angle and try again. So same 4 shots. First one, still bouncing, so obviously a somewhat decent angle still. Second shot is bounce. And the 3rd shot is coming now. As you can see, the 3rd and final shot penetrated, so obviously that wasn't enough an angle. So what you want to do is angle is, in this tank, would be angle that steeply and use cover like the rock in front of me to bounce basically anything. This is my recommendation. Now we can go back to the garage and I'll explain how hull down tactics work. And last but not least, we come to hull down tactics. Now, in real life, this is probably the strategy most tanks will use, and some may have actually heard of it. Basically what it entails is your tank being either behind cover or on the crest, almost cresting a shallow hill or dune or rise, whatever you want to say. So basically that the gun will be pointing like this, so you'll only see maybe here. The obvious benefits of this is the less you can see of the tank, the less you can hit. And tanks like the Carnarvon lends itself very good because it has good gun depression, i.e. it can get its turret down at a fair good angle. I don't remember exactly how steep it goes down, but it is very good. Some tanks, on the other hand, like the Chinese and Russian mediums, heavies, and all them, have very poor elevation, mostly due to the fact that they have very low turrets, because if you do not know, the gun of a tank will extend well beyond the inside of the turret. So obviously this thing might not be able to go down more than maybe here, so maybe like that, so obviously that limits how steep a rise it can go over. With the most extreme ones on the opposite end being American heavies, like the T-29, the T-32, the T-34, and the T-30, as I'm just going to show the best turrets off these 3 or 4 tanks right now. If we look at, oh, wrong button. If we look at the T-34, and then we go to the T-30, which I believe only has 1 turret. Let me just double check that. Yes, it does. So if we look at this, we can notice that all of these, the 3 heavy tanks and the 1 tank destroyer, have ridiculously good frontal turret armor. 279 for the tier 7. The tier 8 heavy normal has 298, whereas tier 8 premium has 279, and the tier 9 tank destroyer has also 279. This is not taking into account the thickness of the mantlet, which you can kind of see here is really thick. These things will rarely, if ever, be penetrated from the front. They also have really tall turrets, which allow them to get a really good gun depression and thus hit their targets more easily. And we'll try and show you a replay where I use cover and hold down tactics to my advantage. And here you can see an example of well, I guess it isn't perfect hold down tactics because of the way the terrain is. Unfortunately, these hills are a little steeper than what I can manage. But this is a relatively decent hold down spot. As you can see, I've covered most of my front with this hill. If you see how I can see all of that area from where I was. Unfortunately, I decided to try and find another spot that covers more, which lets that Tiger 2 there take my good spot. So if we speed it up a bit, you can see me trying, okay, there, and then I see some enemies, and I'm like, oh, I gotta get in position. Then he does that, and I'm like, oh. Of course, he had to take my spot, so I try and find somewhere good to shoot from. I end up over here, much more exposed, although still somewhat in cover due to the dip in the terrain. As you can see, I'm using this tank's accuracy, supporting my team, which is exactly what you're supposed to do in Carnarvon. So you can see me looking in and out a little bit, I'm sure. And let's just speed this up because, well, there's not much going on. We shoot a bit, bang, bang, bang. They don't really shoot back. They're too occupied with 3, 4 heavies over there. But me and this Tiger 2 do a really good account of ourselves. That IS-3 has no idea what's about to hit him. Bang, I kill him. Now I believe I can get into another hold down position up here. Look here. Now this is, well, obviously I exposed myself to try and get that shot, but now this is kind of a hold down position. And as you see, he shot and hit me right on my mantle, and it bounced off. That is a gun with 225mm of penetration. Technically, he should go right through my turret, considering we only have 165. And there again, bounce. Again, somewhere. That was actually off the upper glacis, but because of the hill, we actually angle upwards. As weird as that sounds. And just before the end, we managed to kill that IS-3 because it makes a mistake of going in the open. Bang. And bang. And I secure the kill because that's what I do. So yes, that's hold down. As you see here, I could shoot all of his tank in the open. He could only shoot about that, which resulted in those 2 bounces. Well, now that we've gone through all 3 tutorials, hopefully you'll have a better understanding as to how all this stuff works and how you can use it on the battlefield. So remember, hold down or angle those tanks, and remember to like, favorite, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.